Good evening, everybody, or good whatever time it is, wherever you are. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre, and it's my pleasure this evening to both provide an acknowledgement of country, after which I will introduce today's speaker. Before we start that, though, may I acknowledge the original owners of the land on which the university is based, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This is land that was never ceded, and we acknowledge their traditions and customs and recognise their elders past, present and emerging. Today's webinar is being provided by Professor Reza Hazmat, who is from the University of Alberta in Edmonton in Canada. Reza is an old friend of the China Studies Centre and of some of us who work here too. He also is now the editor of the Journal of Civil Society, which is really something he may wish to talk about later, but is certainly a great achievement. He's published a lot on NGOs in China, on civil society, and as you will know from what he's about to tell you, he recently, earlier this year, published a study of Chinese perceptions of the rest of the world, which he's going to talk about. After he's spoken, we will pose questions to him on comments. Please put your questions and your comments in the Q&A, the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen on your Zoom panel, and we'll take it from there. So now, without further ado, over to Reza. Please, all to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the warm introduction. And I just want to thank the China Studies Centre for putting on this webinar. This is a very timely conversation insofar that the Prime Minister of Australia will be attending, meeting with the Chinese officials in a few days. So I hope some of the insights that was gathered from this survey, looking at how everyday Chinese people see the world, can provide some sort of nuances to many of the major topics that's being discussed pertaining to Australia-China relations, as well as global relations with China. So please bear with me while I share my screen, and I'll get right into the conversation. Okay. So I don't think it'd be hyperbolic to suggest that there has been rising tensions between China and Western jurisdictions in this decade. I think the last prime minister to visit China from Australia was in 2016. And if you go through other of the Western jurisdictions, you see really an increasing in sort of diplomatic tensions between China and those jurisdictions. You have tensions residing around China increasingly using its growing economic and political power to assert its influence worldwide, often contrary to Western nations' interests. So Western jurisdictions have repeatedly accused China of stealing and exporting potential dual-use technologies abroad. This has led to security and regulatory reviews of Chinese-based technology companies who have a close relationship with the Communist Party. We see Western nations, including the Five Eyes Alliance, the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, have been quite critical of China's domestic behavior when it comes to select human rights issues. They also view China's close relations with Russia, especially during this ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, as unduly problematic. So ultimately, what we can argue is that Western nations tend to see China simultaneously as a potential negotiating partner on select global issues, as an economic and military competitor, and a systemic rival promoting alternative governance models, really with a greater focus on the latter two. Now, we can argue that although China's rise as a major power in the 21st century has made it a key player in global affairs, one super aspect that deserves attention is how its own citizens and their own attitudes towards foreign jurisdictions. Ultimately, how Chinese citizens perceive the world have profound implications for China's future behavior domestically and abroad. So while the party has a monopoly over the political system, it does require political or popular support and legitimacy for its public policies and conduct. And we see this when the party monitors public opinion and conducts public opinion analysis. This ultimately means that the general public's support or dissatisfaction with China's foreign policy and activities could potentially translate to future support or dissatisfaction with the party and the state itself. So what we ended up doing, and by we, I mean the University of Alberta's China Center and myself, we ran this Chinese Citizens Global Perception Survey in earlier this year. This CCGPS survey is the first iteration of its kind, at least in terms of the manner in which it's conducted. So this is more of an academic survey. It's not a poll. So it is a online and telephone national survey where we're looking at a demographically representative, statistically valid sort of views of the citizenry. So I think what makes it much more interesting here is that we are able to capture the rural population more so with the survey than, say, other flash polls might be able to do. And it took about 2 months to gather all this information in the first part of this year. What the survey attempts to do is to look at citizens' perspectives on China's current relations with global actors, including Australia, Canada, the EU, France, Germany, India, Japan, Russia, the UK, and the US. Now, in this talk, I will focus on discussing the major findings pertaining to Chinese citizens' general global perception, their global interaction preferences, and sources of knowledge of global jurisdiction. Ultimately, as I've mentioned beforehand, how Chinese citizens perceive the world has profound implications for China's future domestic and international behavior, as well as how global actors intimately engage with China. Okay, so let's start with the general global perception. Now, I'll say a few words about Australia in every slide that I show you, but I'm going to give you a great overview here. Now, it shouldn't be surprising to see that when we asked respondents who has the most global influence, the United States is dramatically has the highest perception of global influence in the world. So that's not a surprising finding. What was interesting was to see Russia was just second. So they saw Russia and the EU very closely being an influential global power. And for us, that was a bit surprising given the sort of perceptions in other jurisdictions. Despite its vast population, growing economy, and possession of nuclear weapons, India received the lowest score, 3.5. So these are all scales between 1 to 7. It's these Likert scales. So an average of 4 would be seen as a norm. Anything below or above that is seen as something interesting. What's particularly interesting is to see Australia scores second lowest in the global influence perception. In other words, everyday Chinese citizens do not see Australia having much of an influence globally. And what we're going to see throughout many of the responses is that Canada and Australia have very similar responses. And so that was also surprising, being a Canadian-based academic. Let me continue with some other findings, and then we'll talk about the implications. Trust in global partners. Now, trust is something that you intimately need in order to engage with the other actor. If two nations don't trust each other, they don't engage, or they engage in a very rivalrous or in a very antagonistic fashion. So trust is super important for us. So even though we do see an escalation of great power competition between the United States and China, respondents generally have low levels of trust in the United States. It's quite interesting. And then here's Russia, where they're seen as the most trustworthy sort of actor. And what you're going to find throughout these the responses in the surveys, that Russia is seen in a very positive light. I'll talk a bit more about why that's the case. Now, it's not necessarily because Russia has been in the news as of late and so forth, but we actually, if you go back over the last few years, we're seeing that Russia has increasingly been a trusted partner, increasingly seen in a positive light. So it's not necessarily because of the Russia-Ukraine sort of conflict occurring at this juncture. what we saw is that Chinese perceptions of the UK, Australia, and Canada, the three main Anglo-Saxon allies of the US, are generally more moderate. In the eyes of the Chinese citizenry, France and Germany, two influential members of the EU, are viewed as more trustworthy than the EU as a bloc. So that's also noteworthy there. Although China has territorial disputes with Japan and India, its citizens' perceptions of both nations are notably different. It's going to be surprising to the China scholars or Asian scholars in the room that trust in Japan is extremely low, 2.6. That's for historical reasons. Trust in India, 3.8, is moderate despite the ongoing conflict over disputed territory. And then, as I mentioned, despite the recent invasion of Ukraine, Chinese citizens still perceive Russia as a trustworthy partner. We have 5.4 there. What we see when we do a bit more rigorous sort of regressions, we can see that there's a strong positive correlation between trustworthiness of a different country and familiarity. So in other words, the more the average Chinese citizen reported that they were familiar with a country, the more likely they were to trust that country. This holds true for all countries except the United States. Now, the sort of takeaway there is if you are a nation trying to increase trust, you do need to become more familiar and in a much more intimate fashion. So you might want to adjust your public affairs model. You might want to market your country to the everyday Chinese citizenry. Now, what we do see is that, of course, because the survey is so multifaceted and so far, it is reaching the rural populations. It's reaching harder to reach populations in China that's not normally captured. What's really interesting is that when that familiarity sort of relationship, the more you're familiar with the country, whether positively or negatively, mind you, the more likely you are to trust that country, except the United States, of course. Let's move on to long-term importance to China. Again, we see Russia's prominence here, where Russia is viewed as the most important nation to China's long-term future, which really is in line to the general positive views of Russia throughout the survey. We also see that there's a perception that Japan is relatively insignificant to China's long-term future. India and Australia and Canada are seen as not as significant. In other words, the everyday Chinese citizen sees Russia, the EU, and the United States as having more long-term importance to China than to the other jurisdictions that were examined. Now, this must be qualified by looking at likelihood of military conflict in the next decade. We asked the general public, what is the likelihood, effectively, of a military conflict with China in the next decade? Now, given intensified China-US competition in the 2020s, it's not surprising to see that the general public perceive the United States as a jurisdiction that's most likely to engage in a military conflict with China in the next decade. Japan and India, the two nations that have territorial disputes with China, rank second and third, respectively. Russia is seen as the least likely to have a conflict with China, reinforcing the sort of high trust that the citizenry seems to have in Russia. Now, it's important to note that we did not ask questions pertaining to Taiwan. We made the decision that was perhaps a bit too sensitive to ask at that stage. So we asked a sort of broader question about a military conflict, but perhaps in the next iteration, we might be able to ask perhaps in a roundabout way or in a direct fashion about conflict or potential conflict with Taiwan. So that's a sort of general perception that the Chinese citizenry has. And we also ask questions about China's global roles, and I think that's the one I'm going to turn my attention to next. Ultimately, the question we're going to ask is, what issue area should China take an active leadership role globally? Interestingly enough, citizens were asked to rate across 8 categories of global engagement, which area China should take an active global leadership, whether we're looking at international trade, global financial standards, environmental governance, technology and innovation, education, poverty alleviation, public health, and peace and security. What we saw is that peace and security is the most important issue area for the everyday Chinese citizen. And this was seen as the area in which Chinese global leadership can actually play a major role. This is followed by technology and innovation. The latter is really interesting because technology and innovation has been a key priority of the party, especially during the Xi Jinping era. And in fact, if you look at the 5-year plans, it's quite prominent in the current 5-year plan. Meanwhile, the areas in which respondents thought were least important for Chinese global leadership, global financial standards, environmental governance, are generally considered areas of domestic weakness and relatively poor state performance. So what we've seen here is that the citizens have not played do not see that as a major, relatively speaking, do not see that as a major role that China should take globally. Now, of course, these vary by age categories. And I think what's really interesting about the survey is in aggregate, we have a picture. When we disaggregate it by age categories, we're seeing micro-generations and variance in micro-generations, which can be difficult to analyze because effectively what I'm suggesting to you is that we have multiple Chinas by region, but we also have multiple Chinas by age categories. And this is much different than, say, in other jurisdictions where the age categories their viewpoints don't shift that dramatically. Now, to give examples of this, when we look at the youngest cohorts that we were able to examine, citizens reporting of the importance of Chinese global leadership role is highest among the youngest cohorts, with an average rating of 6.1 in contrast to 5.7. However, an individual's education or income are not closely correlated to perceptions of China's global leadership role. So we do see a difference in terms of how the young perceives which areas China should take an active global leadership role versus, say, the middle-aged and more older sort of crowds. And this tells us that there is a potential shift at a micro-generational level in the way in which Chinese citizens perceive the way in which the country should actually take a leadership role. Whereby, to be very crude, the young see the environment as more important to them than, say, the older generations who might see other sort of categories of interest. Now, this is super important and interesting as well, given your prime minister's meeting in China, as well as other world leaders increasing their sort of relationships with China. And the question we ask here is, should China limit or expand cooperation? So we did this in two ways. We did this, should China limit or expand economic cooperation? And should China limit or expand technological and research collaboration? So increasingly, what we see is that rather than being especially pro or anti-decoupling, the Chinese public expressed a preference for expanding trade and investment relations and technology and research collaboration with the majority of jurisdictions. This is consistent across all income levels. And we really see, remember that it's a Likert scale between between 1 and 7. So 4 would be the sort of the norm. We see here that norm being much increasing. So we have a score of 4 and above for all the sort of questions that we were asking here, pretty much in terms of should China limit or expand economic cooperation, and should China limit or expand technological and research collaboration, with Australia scoring 4.6 for economic cooperation and 4.7, for technological and research collaboration. By income, we see something very similar, that between 4.5 and 4.8 in terms of household income in RMB. So there is not a major sort of variance in aggregate that the Chinese public does not really support decoupling. They're not necessarily pro or anti. What's interesting is that, again, Russia consistently receives the highest score, and Japan and India the lowest. So it does tell us that there is an appetite among the public to have cooperation with Western jurisdictions, and there isn't that sort of antagonism that might be seen in other sorts of work coming out of China now. Let me continue to looking at attitudes towards China's global engagement. So the survey asked respondents to rate their agreeableness between 1, strongly disagree, and 7, strongly agree, with a series of 6 statements. on Chinese foreign affairs and international relationships. So as you can see in the slide, the statements are written there. I'll just read it so people are aware of what to reiterate what the findings were. Statement number 1, China should currently concentrate more on domestic affairs than on global matters. The score is 3.8. China is currently too open to foreign influence and thinking, 3.7. The more a nation cooperates with China, the better off those nations will be, 4.3. China's relationship with Western nations will be more competitive rather than cooperative in the next decade, 4.1. China's political and economic models should be exported to other nations, 3.6. And China should change international practices and laws to reflect Chinese norms and values, 4.1. All responses hovered around this neutral mark. A score for statements 4 and 6 would indicate that the Chinese public favors hawkish foreign policy decisions that could potentially lead to great antagonism with Western jurisdictions. But when we see the scores of 4.1 for both statements, it suggests for some, but not widespread appetite for competition with the West. Similarly, when we look at statements 3 and 5, it would indicate an appetite for China to take a more expansionist foreign policy. The responses illustrate that while the public is generally in favor that cooperation with China leads to better outcomes for nations, public opinion opposes the notion that China should seek to export its model to other nations. Finally, agreement with statements 1 and 2 would indicate widespread public support for the Chinese state to roll back its international engagement, restrict foreign influence, and focus domestically. What the results suggest is that the Chinese citizenry believes that China is not too open to foreign influence, thus indicating, albeit lukewarm, popular support for continued Chinese global engagement. Disaggregated further, Chinese citizens living in larger cities have a higher probability of believing that there will be more competition between China and Western jurisdictions. Individuals living in towns and counties are more likely to believe that China should export its modes to foreign jurisdictions and change international practices within its own standards. So we do see variations again based on geography. Okay, I'm going to say a few more words now about tourism, study, work, and immigration preferences. In other words, where do we see the public views global interactions over the next decade? So despite rising tensions between China and most Western jurisdictions, there is still a strong desire for the Chinese population to engage with these jurisdictions on a personal level in the next 10 years. Again, respondents have a highly favorable view of Russia as a destination for travel, work, and immigration. The United States is the most popular destination choice for studying abroad, followed closely by the United Kingdom. And what we do see is that most immigration preferences at a statistically relevant level revolved around employment. So people want to migrate for employment reasons. What we see is that people want to migrate for increased income in many respects. Now, what was really fascinating is that Russia, Canada, and France and Australia were the top destinations for immigration. We were surprised by Russia as a source of destination for immigration, but we were not too surprised by Canada and Australia. What we saw was that India, Japan, and Germany were destinations of least interest. Now, while Canada and Australia are home to a sizable mainland Chinese population, which explains a continued interest in both nations as an immigration destination, as I said, Russia is still surprising. Now, overall, the popularity of Russia as a destination for tourism, work, and immigration suggests that there is popular support for expanding China-Russia political, economic, cultural, and people-to-people relations. I think it's worthwhile saying a few more words about Russia in this instance. What we see is that the youngest generation, so the 17-year-olds and below, the 18 to 22-year-olds, the 20-somethings, are more inclined to want to have greater ties with Russia than, say, the other age categories. So we're seeing that there's a shifting in sort of attitudes from that particular standpoint, from a micro-generational standpoint. Part of it can be the COVID effect. Part of it can be the fact that the younger population are hoping to move away more from Western jurisdictions, where their preferences are to go to areas where they see as much more interesting than, say, the West. Part of it can also be that there are actual economic opportunities to be had in Russia. As Western jurisdictions have pretty much moved out of Russia, it gives a vacuum it provides a vacuum for Chinese enterprises and Chinese firms, as well as Chinese enterprising individuals to go into Russia. So there are economic opportunities to be had in Russia, given the fact that most, or if not all, Western jurisdictions have pretty much moved out of the Russian sort of jurisdiction. We also see having knowledge in a host nation language generally played a role in a destination of choice. So, for example, those who reported knowing French and German are more likely to express wanting to visit, study, work, and emigrate to France and Germany, respectively. The only sort of caveat is that this doesn't hold for Japan. As I mentioned, the younger cohorts are more likely to express a willingness to go to Russia, but also to emigrate to Germany. If you're married, you're more likely to want to immigrate to Australia. Individuals living in China's urban areas are more likely to want to immigrate to Australia. For Communist Party members, if they wanted to immigrate, France is a destination of choice. What was interesting is that having study abroad experience or not played no statistical role in wanting to emigrate. That is something that needs to be disaggregated a bit further, and something that I need to think a bit more deeply about. But the expectation would be if you did have study abroad experience in the host jurisdiction, you would want to migrate to that host jurisdiction. But we don't actually see a statistical sort of relationship there. So that is something of note. Going back to knowledge and sources of global jurisdiction, what we can argue is this. We can look again, remember the thesis that I mentioned that being familiar with the jurisdiction engineers greater trust in the jurisdiction. So the question we're going to look at is, does knowledge of the jurisdiction and trust in global jurisdiction, how do they relate in a much more acute fashion? So what we see here is that respondents consider themselves to be relatively highly knowledgeable about the United States and Russia, which received scores of 5.1 and 4.9 respectively. Now, this is partially attributable to both jurisdictions' dominance in global and domestic news cycles in 2023, but respondents also consider themselves to be more knowledgeable about Japan, perhaps owing to Japan's proximity and historical ties to China. Chinese citizens had substantially less knowledge about all other nations. Respondents consider themselves to be at the median point for two nations, the UK and India, whereas for Australia, Germany, Canada, the EU, and France, respondents consider themselves to be less knowledgeable, relatively speaking. It's noteworthy here because there is little correlation between the knowledge and trust in that respect. For instance, the three jurisdictions with the highest knowledge scores, the United States, Japan, and Russia, have different trust ratings, with the United States and Japan deemed the most untrustworthy and Russia considered most trustworthy. Now, this is where we're seeing shifting sort of sources of information. So the idea here was to try and figure out, well, how do citizens learn about the nation? How do they learn about other actors globally? Overwhelmingly, it is not about traditional media anymore. It's about social media. It's about, that is the way in which, across all age categories, pretty much, we see social media dominating in terms of how you obtain information about global affairs. When we look at other sorts of categories, we see discussion with others is also considered popular and scores highest among the youngest demographic. Akin to other Western jurisdictions, usage of newspapers and radio declines among the younger cohorts. Now, the implications here are interesting. It tells us how is public opinion being shaped? How is this being shaped within China's closed and heavily censored media environment? In the past, the main way to receive news in China was through TV, radio, and newspapers, which for the most part were state-controlled in a rigorous fashion. Now, of course, the Chinese state does impose restrictions on social media, but the dominance of social media and word of mouth over traditional news sources that are more directly controlled by the government, they indicate the emergence of a much more decentralized news environment driven by everyday citizens rather than major media organizations. Let me put it to you in a different way. If you want to influence Chinese public opinion, you do need to use different strategies. It needs to be a social media strategy. You need to infuse the sort of networks and nodes through social media. And of course, for the much more prominent, either economically or in terms of knowledge of the world, we do see that Chinese citizens, many do use VPNs to access social media, that they're able to get news from the world. So it is a very different demographic. We're seeing a different sort of shift in the way in which people receive news media, receive news about global affairs, that is. Now, this is an interesting question. We asked the question, does a government's action accurately reflect the will and attitudes of its people? And my thinking here was this. Often, so I'll pick on my own country. If the Canadian government does X, it doesn't necessarily mean it reflects the will of the general public. It reflects the will of the government, who in theory should be the will of the public, but that may not always be hand in hand. So the question then is, do the Chinese public see the government's action as the popular will of that country? And that was overwhelming sort of broad agreement within the Chinese population that a government's action broadly reflects its citizens' will. So if the Canadian government does X and it's publicized in China, Chinese citizens tend to believe that is what the everyday Canadian public wants and believes. And so there's, and I think that's an interesting sort of attitudinal sort of response, because it tells us there's no divorce among the Chinese public between a government's action and the popular will or the views of the citizenry in a particular jurisdiction globally. Now, this was the case across age and income categories as well. Okay, so what are the discussions? I threw a lot of data at you. I threw a lot of information at you. I'm going to try and say a few sort of implications, a few sort of main discussion points here. So China really is at a crossroads with its interaction with major Western jurisdictions. What the data suggests is that the Chinese public overwhelmingly supports a China that peacefully coexists with other global powers in the international sphere. It's not only rhetoric. We could be cynical and say this is peaceful rise, etc., of China that the party usually espouses and has been doing so for quite some time. But the Chinese public overwhelmingly supports a peaceful coexistence with other global powers in the international sphere. This is demonstrable insofar that the citizenry considers global peace and security as the most significant leadership role China should undertake now and in the future. Yet, with all jurisdictions, there are numerous strategic interests to balance that can compromise this meta goal. China's stated objective to improve its technological and research standing is the most prevalent strategic interest that can incite further global tensions. As I mentioned, the 5-year plan, the current one that is from 2021 to 2025, China aims to develop basic research and significant breakthroughs in core technologies to the extent that the nation can become a global leader in technological innovation. R&D investment has increased by 7% annually to support this plan. The data from the survey indicates that the citizenry overwhelmingly supports China becoming a technological and innovation leader as a key priority. This is the second most important global role Chinese citizens want their nation to undertake. Now, how will China marry both goals? To be a leader in global peace and security, and yet to develop technology and innovation that ultimately challenges the current hegemony led by the United States. This is a tricky balance that the citizenry does not really account for. Albeit, to be fair, the Chinese public does suggest that the United States is the jurisdiction most likely to engage in conflict in China, with China in the next decade. I'm going to show you a couple of data points here. So I did some scatter plots here looking at sort of relationship between various jurisdictions and China. Without going deep into each sort of 7x7 I'm showing here of the scatter plots, it visually illustrates a sort of polarization between the United States and China. It is all skewed in one particular fashion. There's no common ground, effectively. in the various kinds of categories. So trust as a partner, the importance of relationship, likelihood of military conflict, was the US or China did a good job in COVID-19 performance, global influence, familiarity, economic cooperation, technological and research collaboration. So the data shows there's a huge polarization between US and China. What we also see from the data, when you look at these scatter plots, the constant theme whereby there's a closer and favorable Russia-China relationship. I'll be happy to say a bit more about each of the scatter plots in Q&A, but I just wanted to show you the sort of visualization of how polarized and how close the US and Russia relationships are with China. I'll show Canada, Australia, and United Kingdom as well. The belief that Australia is trustworthy is positively correlated with Chinese citizens' interest in studying, working, and immigrating, while negatively correlated with no interest in Australia. We see that trustworthiness has no significant impact on citizens' willingness to travel. So it's less polarized between Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. With the EU, Germany, and France, they're highly positively correlated. Citizens view the EU as more influential and important than Germany and France individually. And for India and China, there's an unfavorable relationship across pretty much all the categories. So how to summarize all this information and what sort of parting words can I say? Well, China's coupling with Russia or the citizenry's sort of favorable view with Russia should not be necessarily viewed as the crystallization of this sort of bipolar global order with Russia and China on one end and Western jurisdictions on the other. The data suggests that there are points of interaction supported by the Chinese public that can serve as a means of bridging potential disputes between China and Western jurisdictions. For me, there's encouragement that the citizenry do not perceive major divergence in cultural values as a significant driver of discontent between China and Western jurisdictions. I didn't present too much about the cultural norms and values, but there are some questions that was asked in the survey about what is the sort of discontent? Is it value based, or is it much more instrumental? And for the most part, the citizenry viewed it was not a value basis that drove discontent or potential disputes between China and Western jurisdictions. Rather, they were more instrumental. Now, what that tells us is there is room, at least in an ideational level, which can support common policy goals. What I mean by that is, when we look at disputes, when disputes are generally rooted in value variances, it's often very difficult to have that common ground. What the citizenry at least is reporting in China is that most of the perceived issues between the West and China are not value-oriented. Rather, it is more of an instrumental one. It's a story in which China is trying to rise and become a much more important player globally. And it's a story in which the citizenry believes that, well, jurisdictions that have the power at this juncture are going to oppose China's peaceful rise, shall we say. That's the picture that the citizenry sees in many respects, and that's what the data supports. So let me stop here and perhaps Q&As, and I can answer any of the questions you might have. But I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Reza. So I'm asking, we've asked that people should put their comments or their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Whilst we're waiting for that, I wonder if you'd like to share with us the kind of technical background to the material. How many people? Where were they? How were you selected? Who did the interviewing on the phone or whatever? You know.
Right. So let me just grab my screen so I can actually share with you. Well, rather not speak to you about the actual technical data. Okay. So we had the way we approached it was twofold. One, we did an online survey, and we did a telephone survey. That was more for budgeting reasons, I'll be very frank, but the telephone survey was more geared towards the rural population, hard to reach populations. in one of the slides, you can actually, well, maybe I can share my screen again. Actually, you can see, apologies for my fingers, this is the worst computer in the world. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen for a second. So here we can actually see the sort of demographics here and the sort of heat map and where we polled people. So the surveyor we had online was a private firm, a marketing firm actually. And the online one, and the telephone survey was done through universities who I've worked with in the past. We tried to capture as much of the population we can using census tracts, but using the National Bureau of Statistics census tracts there. You can see that we have a good gender distribution. The age distribution actually is akin to the census population, at least the 2021. Communist Party membership was 16%, so slightly higher than the norm. Employment is very similar to the current. Income as well, very similar. Education, very similar. Marital status. Pretty much, we didn't use weights for this at all. So we did purposeful sampling. So we kept on going until we found the sort of samples that met the sort of quotas that we had. But there were no weights employed for the survey. So yeah, I think that's the sort of general sort of sort of technical aspects there. Again, the idea here was perhaps the sort of bias might be in the online and telephone. Online, generally, we acquire a much more affluent population, a much more urban population, a much more younger and educated population. But this was tempered by the fact we were able to use the sort of random digit dialing telephone survey.
Was it expensive doing that, Reza? I mean, you had to use a company in China, presumably.
Very expensive, David. Very expensive. That's luckily yeah, it was by slightly more than Western standards, I shall say. Yeah.
Okay, we've got some questions here, so I'll read out the first if you're ready for it. Neville asks, is there any China geographic differentiation for attitudes to the West? For example, does Guangdong province have a more favorable view?
In terms of the geography, I would say there's a difference in terms of urban and rural. Let's start there. I think the rural population are more, at least from the sample, are more likely to espouse the party's line. And it's interesting because, and what I mean by that is it's much more favorable of Russia. It's much more favorable of China becoming a global leader in more in the areas that we looked at in terms of peace and security, in terms of technological sort of advancements. So they're more likely to eschew those kinds of propositions. The urban population, and particularly in major metropolises, so the Beijings and Shanghais of the world, were slightly more skeptical. But I want to be quite careful when I say by the skeptical citizen. They realized they were quite more aware of global political realities than we gave them credit for, because we went in there thinking the general population are not that aware of the sort of nuances of Western and Chinese sort of relations. We're quite surprised to see in some of the responses that the urban population were super aware and they're much more instrumental. Insofar, China needs to do this because it betters the Chinese state. I mean, to be very frank, that's what all jurisdictions do. All nations generally work within their own self-interest. And we saw this is no exception in the Chinese case, but it's much more pronounced among the urban sample. There are much more differentiations as well in terms of education and income. We would think that those who were benefactors of greater cooperation with the West would support greater cooperation with the West, but we didn't see much of a relationship there statistically. So yeah.
And it might vary from country to country in the West as well, of course.
Of course.
Yeah. So we have another question here that didn't come in through Q&A. So can I just remind you, please put your questions in Q&A. But this one came in through chat. And it refers, I think, to the questions I asked you before about methods. So based on China's huge population, Do you think the number of participants in this survey is sufficient to draw conclusions? I could answer that, but I'll let you do it.
So this is a great question that well, it's an interesting question we always get for any surveys. So this is a representative sample from an academic standpoint. That is it's purposefully sampled, that is tested against the census data. Of course, there's a margin of error, but what I think what makes this survey much different than perhaps competing ones, shall I say, or existing ones out there, is we're capturing the rural population more. So we're capturing a much more broader base than a quick sort of flash poll. So often when you see, so the Pew Center, for example, if they do a poll, or it's often a flash poll. It's done within a day or two, and it's usually online. And so there, I would say, sure, it may not be fully representative, but it might give you some sort of mood of that particular population you're examining. This one, it's much more academically oriented, much more academically stringent. So it is capturing more of what the population thinks. Now, in terms of how to interpret the data, that's a different story, and perhaps that's the heart of your question. I think what needs to be done more so, and I think this is where we need to be careful as Western policymakers, foreign policy actors, as academics, is realizing that China is shifting. The demographics, I mean, and this is so hard to capture. So if I put my sociological hat on, if I was to examine Australia, generally speaking, we don't see much variance by age categories to that extent. So the 20-something-year-olds, within the 20-something-year-olds, won't be much of a variance within that category. We're seeing micro variations in age perception. And that's difficult to capture for this survey because the N size doesn't allow us to do it as fully. Why that's important, so moving from the technical to why this is super important, is that there is a population in China that is shifting their ways and their perceptions of the West. They're not, I mean, beforehand, anecdotally, China, when China's opening up in the 2000s, early 2000s, you saw that there was greater sort of, they saw the West as a model in many ways, where they saw the West as a good actor, shall we say, the actor in which you can have a partnership with. That shifted. It's no longer the perception. Young students don't want to go to the West as much. They actually want to stay in China, or they might want to go to Russia, or there's more opportunities for them. So you are seeing micro variations at the generational level between how participants see the world. And I think that is perhaps what more refined surveys need to look at, but it's really hard to capture that.
Thank you. So another question for you. Did you find any data as to whether social media consumption played a role in having certain perceptions of different countries? For example, if an individual consumes social media consistently versus someone who barely used it?
So it's not necessarily, it's a great question again, it's not necessarily using social media or using social media, it's how you use it. So as the data illustrated, most people get their news about the world through social media across all age categories. Where it becomes interesting is when they discuss the news that they're looking at, they're discussing it with their immediate social circles online. So that's where the social media aspects play a major role in terms of perceptions of other nations. So let me put you in a different way. It's a model where you receive the information about the world through social media for the most part. Then your the sort of ideas that you generate from that sort of news, it's going to be reinforced through the sort of social networks you are having on social media. So it's proofing your sort of proofing sort of methodology that's going on here to crystallize your views of the world. Now, what that means is, if you want to influence how your nation is viewed, social media is perhaps the best way to do so, and that is the way in which you are going to most likely affect your perceptions of the everyday Chinese citizen. So definitely, it plays a major role. And it plays a major role in certain perceptions of different countries, Russia withstanding as well. If you look at the younger generation and their sort of social media, so this is outside the purview of the survey, but in other work, we're finding that when young people talk about Russia, they talk about it in a positive light. So it reinforces this idea that Russia can be a good actor, can be a good player, can be someone in which you can study, you can work, you can travel to. Mind you, there's instrumental reasons. It's also cheaper to go to Russia right now. And it's on the approved travel list for tours. And it's also great economic opportunities as the West has moved out. So there are instrumental reasons as well. But social media does play a role in reinforcing that.
Good. Next question. This is a big question. You'll love this. Are the Chinese people's views in line with the government's views, or do they diverge?
This is such a massive question. You're right. I think there's this idea that if the government says X, citizens believe X. I think we need to dispel that myth. It's a much more complicated process. Now, of course, in the long term, if you look at the educational textbooks, if you can look at the sort of influences that people have in terms of their news and so forth, there are state influences. Let's not be naive not to believe that. But we do see a critical citizen. We do see a skeptical citizen. We do see citizens who have their own views of the world, which may not be in line. So the question might be, are the government's views in line with the citizenry's views? That's perhaps a more important question. And I would suggest to you that, in fact, it is, for the most part, that the government's line is in line with the citizens' views. I can't stress this enough. The Chinese state monitors public opinion better than most states that I know of. And so they're acutely aware of what the citizenry believes. So in many respects, what this survey is kind of revealing is what the citizenry thinks. And it's not surprising that we see this there's a lot of alignment with what the state does. It's not necessary. We're no longer in a situation where it's solely the state does X and the citizenry believes X. It's quite the opposite now, in fact. It's more of a situation where the citizenry believes Y and the state says maybe we should follow it Y.
Yeah, good. Another question. This person says, Wenjing says, thanks for sharing. May I please ask, what do you think are the practical implications of this survey for Australia? Does it have an impact on Australia's attitude towards China? Well,
great question again. I don't think this survey will have any impact on Australia's views towards China, because that's not the point of the survey. The point is to see how Chinese citizens view the world. But I think it'd be surprising to the Australian public to hear that Chinese citizens don't think values between Australia and China is a major deterrent in terms of cooperation. Whereas that's often the sort of different dialogue we have in Australia or in Western jurisdictions, whereby we believe what our values or norms, the way we perceive the world, is a deterrent or should play a major factor in the way we engage with China. So I think in one respect, the attitudes of Australia it has that sort of resonance. Now, the implications for Australia. Now, as the Prime Minister goes to China, I think there should be a realization that there's a great appetite to continue cooperation with Australia, to continue a close relationship with Australia, and it's done for instrumental purposes because both sides benefit. The Chinese do not see values as a major deterrent. Both sides can benefit from this relationship, and there's an appetite among the citizenry to continue. Remember, the survey suggests that there is no appetite for decoupling or coupling. It's just for instrumental reasons. That's how the Chinese public thinks. Now, if you're an Australian foreign policy maker or actor, you can use this to your advantage, that knowledge. You can use it insofar that the realization that it's a very instrumental public, and it's also an instrumental government. You can use that to your advantage to increase cooperation. Now, here's the kicker that I always think it's always interesting, we always forget. The more a state cooperates with China, the more over time, those values and norms get transfused. So if we want to talk about shifts in values and norms, it takes time. The more you cooperate with an actor, the more likely you are to have that values and norms being transfused to one side. Mind you, it works both ways. The more we're likely to engage with China, the more their values and norms are going to be infused in the Australian side as well. We often think it's one directional. It's bi-directional as well. So I think those are some of the practical implications there. Also, I think Australia needs to do a better job marketing itself in China. I think I think there's been a lag of information about Australia in the Chinese citizenry, especially not in the major cities, but especially among the rural population, especially say in the sort of western regions and the non-eastern seaboard, shall we say. Australia needs to improve its public affairs model insofar that it needs to be better marketing and perceptions of Australia. The survey suggests that Australia is not seen as an important actor. Mind you, as someone who's done work on this in Australia, so I looked at Canada's perception of Australia. This is back in the early 2000s, mind you. I was always surprised that Australians saw Canada as the same as Canadians, but we're less technologically advanced. And that was a shock to Canadians who thinking, why would Australians not think Canada's technologically advanced? Well, there's a lag. The perception of what a country is versus what the perception of the citizenry, there's usually a few years lag. So it's in Australia's interest to continue to project a very positive image of Australia in China. What the fostering of relations have done the last few years is have a greater negative impact of Australia's perception in China. And we're not going to see the full impact of that negative image until a few more years from now, because there's a lag between what the citizens see a country and what the actual reality is. So the practical implication here simply is you need to do a better job marketing Australia in China. That's the sort of big tagline there.
Well, I hope you're going to tell the Prime Minister that. I think he knows. But he has said for the last few days, he stressed the difference in values between the two countries. But of course, he has also said that doesn't mean we can't talk to each other, of course. Another question here. This is interesting. Did you find any information on Chinese views of African countries? And they use the example of given their recent economic investment in Nigeria, but it could, of course, be a number of different places.
Right. It's another great question. Unfortunately, the survey did not look at any African jurisdictions. So there wasn't much information we can provide in that respect there. So I'm sorry about that.
There you go. So, other questions, please. If there are no other questions, I will suggest we thank Reza very much indeed. Do you have plans? What are your plans for this survey going forward? Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Of course. So, of course, some academic papers will be coming out, which has a very different sort of methodology and very different approach than what I presented. This is much more of a general public policy making kind of presentation. The plan is to run this wave every year, do an annual wave. So in January, this 2024 version will come out. The 2024 version will be executed, and it'll come out probably by March. And to do this in the next few years, so we actually have a timeline that we can see over a long period how views are shifting. As I mentioned, it takes time to shift views. It takes a lot of time. So I think it's worthwhile, at least there's a 5-year commitment to look at this. So the plan is to continue looking at this shift or looking at the changes in perception.
And presumably having a year-on-year record will also be useful in itself.
Of course.
Yes. Okay, look, let's thank you very much indeed, Reza. A very nice presentation, very interesting. And we hope to see you again soon in Australia one day.
Would love to. Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone.